All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first JP Historical Society talk of the fall-winter season. We're very excited to have members of the Mary Eliza Project here who are going to talk to you about Jamaica Plain's first women voters. I know this is an interesting location for us to do a talk. This is the first time we've ever done anything in Northeast Arts, but this is, I can hear myself on my laptop in the back. This is the space where women registered to vote in 1920. So this was called Minton Hall back then. So that's why we're here. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the Mary Eliza Project to get us started.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I want to say thank you to the Jamaica Plain Historical Society for inviting us, and also for all of you for joining us today. We represent the Mary Eliza Project. We're a collaborative group of historians and archivists who are researching when and how women first voted in Boston. We use the voter registration records that are in the city's public archives, but are also now online as well. And we'll be talking about that through the presentation today. And we're especially excited to be giving a talk for the very first time at one of the sites where the women were registering to vote. I'm Laura Prieto, and I'm here with Laura Kitchings and Marta Crilly. We're going to be doing the presentation, but I wanted you to see our full team. We are also Erin Wiebe, Molly Copeland, and Coco Lamb, and that's our whole team. Most of us have been working together on this project since 2019, when we began it in anticipation of the 1920 centennial. So in 2020, the centennial of the 19th Amendment. We named our project after this woman, Mary Eliza Mahoney, a lifelong Bostonian who was probably the first trained Black nurse in U.S. history. She was born in 1845 in the West End, and she worked at the New England Hospital for Women and Children. This was a really unusual healthcare facility for the time because it served both white and Black patients. And that meant after the Civil War, it had formerly enslaved mothers there who were giving birth after coming north. Mary Eliza Mahoney's work initially involved cleaning and cooking and other kinds of patient care, such as a nurse's aide would do today. Then in 1872, that same hospital opened a nurse training program. Mary Eliza Mahoney applied. She passed their character test, which is a whole story in itself. Like, there was a character test, and she was accepted. So she graduated at age 34, became a private nurse. She joined the American Nurses Association, had very few Black members at the time, as you might imagine, and she pushed back against discrimination within that group. That was the beginning of her civil rights work. Then in 1908, she helped found the National Association of what was then called Colored Graduate Nurses. Nursing as a profession did not fully integrate until the 1950s. So for all her prominence in nursing history, well, you'll find her name mentioned again and again. Mary Eliza Mahoney also deserved notice for another civil rights accomplishment from later in her life, that is claiming her right to vote in Boston in 1920 at the age of 75. We on the team had read that Mary Eliza was one of the first women in Boston to vote. So as we started transcribing the data from the registers, something we'll talk about in just a couple minutes, we were looking for Mary Eliza's signature, and we found it. Let's see if I can make the pointer work for me. Like, this is her actual signature in the voting records, and that's her line among other women from the South End, where she was living then. So we did find that. And we kept wondering, in fact, this was one of the impulses of the project, like how many other women of color successfully gained the right to vote in Boston. That is, how did Boston compare in 1920 to Southern states, which, as you probably, I hope you know, were blocking Black women and men from registering to vote and successfully voting. We also wanted to uncover the fuller stories of Boston's other many early women voters. That's why we're here today, and we've spoken to other groups around Boston. Over 56,000 women in Boston registered to vote in just about 10 weeks' time between July and mid-October. And looking at them individually and as a group really helps to revise a lot of general assumptions that only a small number of privileged women cared about equal rights at the time or even engagement in politics. So I'd like you to keep in mind here, we consider all these women suffragists, and it's not just the women who gave speeches or marched who were the ones who should count as suffragists. Here's a glimpse at the voter registration records that we worked with. You'll hear much more about this in just a minute from my colleague Marta. Translating them into a more accessible spreadsheet was our first team's task. Though, as you can see, it already resembles a spreadsheet, right? The wider people on Zoom have an advantage looking at this slide, I think, compared to what I'm looking at here. But there's different columns. We replicated the columns on the spreadsheet. So some of them are off the screen, I'm afraid, and I'm trying to use my pen instead of the pointer, so that's why I can find the little. They're both purple in the same shade. So we're a little off screen here, unfortunately, but it says for each woman what ward and precinct she lived in, her name and a place for signature, her address as of April 1st, age, birthplace, occupation, and place of business, if relevant. If citizenship was in question, which it almost always was, if a woman was married or even if she was single and foreign born, citizenship was a question. There was also info about her naturalization. That meant including info about her husband's birthplace and citizenship, as we'll get into later today, why that mattered so much for women in 1920. And then some, again, it's off the screen, unfortunately, but for those on Zoom, can see that there's a column for notes, lots of miscellaneous, like fun, tantalizing things about each woman. Each line in each of these 160 volumes, if I didn't mention that already, gives us clues about a woman who showed up to claim her full right to vote, including about 3,000 women from Jamaica Plain alone. This is just a teaser, but two notable women of Jamaica Plain, whose names you might recognize, are Judith Windsor Smith and her daughter Zilpha Drew Smith. They both lived at 11 Roanoke Avenue here in JP, and we're going to share more, by we, I mean I, will share more about them a little later in the presentation, along with stories of more ordinary women too, of immigrant women, of teachers, of factory workers. There is no ordinary person in our perspective. All of these are extraordinary women, and that's why we want to look into their individual stories, because they all deserve to be known and told. I was just listening to an audiobook on my way here, quoting Katha Pollitt, feminist writer, who said that storylessness has been women's biggest problem historically. So we are here to do our part to help undo that. And next, Marta will explain what the process of registering to vote was like for women in 1920, as women in Boston started showing up to claim that right weeks before the 19th Amendment was actually ratified and certified. They knew that it was coming, so it was even before August 18th and 26th, respectively, that we started finding their names and get clues to what they experienced at the time.
So I want to talk a little bit about the voter registration process for these women, because when we look at the registers, they not only give us information about the individual voters who registered to vote, but they also give us evidence that tells us about the administrative and logistical process of registering over 56,000 women in less than 2.5 months, which was a pretty daunting task. So when we look at the registers, sloppy handwriting and ink blots kind of detail the hectic pace of the registration. Tiny notes about distant male relatives reveal the way that women's citizenship and voting rights were still tied to men. And crossed out entries point out to the women who tried to register but were thwarted. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time looking at what the registers tell us about the registration process and what these women encountered when they arrived at the registration table to claim their rights. So as Laura said, some women started registering to vote weeks before August 18th in anticipation of the 19th Amendment. And so women who registered in early August went to the election department downtown at Boston City Hall to register. And this is a photo of women registering at the election department. You can see, though, from this chart that there isn't a very high volume of registrations until about mid-August. And that makes sense because the 19th Amendment was ratified on August 18th. According to a Boston Globe article of August 20th, the city's election department set up new neighborhood registration sites shortly after the 19th Amendment was ratified. So in the evening, women could register until 10 p.m. at these special registration places. Each ward had its own registration site, and judging from the registers, it appears that these local registration sites were the most popular place to register. And as Laura said, and as Gretchen said, one of those sites, the site for JP, was in this building. So rather than journeying to City Hall during the day, most women went to their local registration site in the evening. And this slide shows a list, well, it's a bit cut off, but you can see this is a list of registration sites by neighborhood, including the site for Jamaica Plains Ward 22, this building. When we think about what these registration sites were like, we can think about lines of women standing out in the evening air, chatting with their neighbors as they waited outside this building and others like it to register to vote. And these lines were made up of all sorts of women, not just women born in Massachusetts or Boston, but women born in Eastern Europe, Ireland, the Caribbean, the American South, and more. And at this building in Jamaica Plain, you would have heard women with Irish and Canadian accents, and you would have heard women chatting in Yiddish, Swedish, German, and other languages. Some women were coming to register after a long day of factory work. Others were coming after a day spent raising children and keeping their homes running. Now, as the last day to register to vote before the presidential election approached, these lines of women got longer and longer and longer. And we see a huge spike in the number of women registering on October 13th, which was the last day that women could register to vote in the 1920 presidential election. On October 13, officials estimated over 10,000 women registered on one day. Boston's Mayor Peters tried to intervene to keep voter registration sites open past 10 p.m., but the head of the election department said, nope, they've got to close at 10 p.m. That's the law. So they closed them then. Now, the chaos of that evening is apparent in many of the last pages of the register, including this register from Dorchester's Ward 18. Though this is a Ward 18 register, we can see that women from multiple wards, these are the wards in the blue crayon, multiple wards are registering. And we also have this huge ink blot, which I think kind of shows a somewhat frantic situation. On October 13th, thousands of women waited in line for hours only to have election officials turn them away at 10 p.m. The women who were turned away were keenly disappointed. Sometimes they were very angry. According to the Boston Herald, over 200 women at a polling location in South Boston, quote, nearly precipitated a riot as they voiced their displeasure at election officials and a lone police officer who was turning them away. This excerpt from the Boston Globe recounts that story as well as other stories, including the very interesting tidbit that one ward in Roxbury only had one clerk registering people on October 13th. I don't know who thought that was a good idea. Many of these women did come back after October 13th and were able to successfully register. They just didn't do it in time for that year's presidential election. Now, getting to the polling place in time was not enough to actually register to vote. When women arrived at the registration table, they often faced additional hurdles before they could sign their name in the register. According to this excerpt from the Boston Globe, prospective voters had to show proof of American citizenship as needed and to demonstrate their literacy skills by reading lines from the state constitution. This literacy test dated from an 1857 amendment to the Massachusetts Constitution. And we do see evidence of clerks applying this literacy test in the registers. For example, here we see a clerk refuse to let Helen Dallin, I think, of East Boston register, noting that she could not read 4 lines of the Constitution. In the American South, as Laura said, literacy tests were a particularly effective way of blocking Black voters from claiming their voting rights because of the obstacles to education that many Black Southerners faced. In Boston, educated Black women like Mary Eliza Mahoney could easily pass a literacy test, but the tests obstructed other voters who didn't have access to education, who had physical disabilities, or who spoke and read English as a second language. The literacy test was just one obstacle that women faced when they attempted to register to vote. Another obstacle was their citizenship status. After 1907, marriage determined a woman's citizenship status. Simply put, when you married, you took on your husband's citizenship. This meant that a native-born American citizen lost her citizenship if she married a foreign-born, unnaturalized man. If her husband subsequently naturalized, she became a naturalized citizen as well. A married woman could not file for naturalization on her own account, and women who married men who were ineligible for citizenship, for example, those who married Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, or other men who were racially ineligible, could not regain their US citizenship, even if they were born in the States. This situation does shift in 1922, but in 1920, married women who sought to register to vote had to bring proof of their husband's citizenship status to the registration table, while foreign-born single women brought their father's papers if they had emigrated as children because they had gotten citizenship through their fathers, or their own papers if they had emigrated as an adult. So for example, here on Alice Clark's registration, the clerk made a point of writing single her own papers. This tells us that Alice emigrated from Nova Scotia on her own as an adult and not with her family as a child. In contrast, Fanny Bernstein, born in Vilna, Russia, in present-day Lithuania, brought her husband's papers. Both Fanny and her husband had been born in the then Russian Empire and were part of a wave of Eastern European immigrants coming to the US and to Boston. But it was her husband William's papers that Fanny had to produce to register to vote. Most of the women who were not able to register appear to have been rejected because of issues with citizenship papers. And their entries often look like this one, Anna Monson's, marked out with a blue crayon, you can see. And then it says no papers right here. In Anna's case, I wondered if she had perhaps immigrated as a child and so didn't have her own papers and wasn't able to get her father's papers. Again, like with the literacy tests, the election department clerks appear to make individual calls about who was and wasn't eligible to vote. When we look at the registers, we see that in their efforts to claim their voting rights, women would sometimes show up with the papers of what I would call an unlikely male relative. So for example, Helen Booth, born in Leominster, Massachusetts, lost her citizenship when she married her Canadian husband, but she didn't bring her husband's naturalization papers with her to the registration table, but her father-in-law's. This was not legal, but she was able to register successfully. In an even stranger situation, Quebec-born Eva Russell of Parker Hill Avenue brought her stepfather's papers. This was absolutely illegal, and yet the clerk let her register. The irony and injustice of this situation with citizenship and naturalization was not lost on suffragists, and their activism was a key part of the Married Women's Act passing in 1922, which finally gave women their own citizenship, separate from male relations. The voter registers show us the diversity of Boston women who lined up to register to vote. even if obstacles like a literacy test or a male relative's citizenship thwarted their efforts. The reality of these voter registration lines differs from the way we often imagine suffragists as white upper-class women. Instead, if we think of suffragists as the women who stood in line for hours, who collected the naturalization papers of male relatives, and who made efforts to pass literacy tests, all to claim their right to vote, we find a much broader range of suffragists, both nationally and also here in Boston. And so I've talked a little bit about the diversity of the women who registered to vote, and I'm going to turn it back over to Laura to talk about the diversity of Boston and JP in 1920.
Thank you. So here we're gonna set the scene, just snapshot of Boston in 1920, and then zoom into Jamaica Plain. The city of Boston had been booming since the late 19th century, with people relocating from around the world, as we've been referring to, as well as from throughout the rural Northeast and also southern states. The population of Boston in 1920 was around 748,000, which is a larger population than today. It was not only the biggest city in Massachusetts at the time, but the fifth largest in the United States. And it was a multiracial city, although the racial and ethnic demographics varied by neighborhood. Jamaica Plain, as you might well know, became part of Boston in 1873 by a vote. Our historical society colleagues will know a lot more about that than I do. I won't pretend. The neighborhood experienced rapid growth in the 1880s and forward, including industrial development. You'll hear a bit later about the Thomas Plant shoe company, for example. Italian and Scandinavian immigrants were joining JP's mid-19th century Irish, German, and continuing Canadian immigrants. We'll be talking some more about that. The elevated train reached Jamaica Plain in 1909, just over there at Forest Hills. This postcard is an image of Forest Hills as it was in 1910. So some of the women who came to vote here might well have used that. Franklin Park Zoo opened in 1912. The last jewel in the emerald necklace, Franklin Park, was a public free site that attracted literally millions of visitors through the 1920s. So that is the neighborhood that we're talking about today. And almost 3,000 women, as I said, living in JP registered to vote in 1920. Here is a short synopsis of the 9 who first came to the Minton building here to register to vote. There were about 50 others who had already registered to vote. They had gone down to, they had to go to City Hall, right, Marta? So they went elsewhere to register with clerks at Boston City Hall earlier in the summer. So their names are in the general register. But these are the names in the register for Ward 22. It was, again, still days before the 19th Amendment would be finally ratified when these 9 claimed their suffrage rights on August 12th. And each woman's entry gives us a quick glimpse of who she was. Together, they also make up, I think, a really interesting composite picture. They range in age from 27 to 55. On the first line, Edith Grossman's age isn't given, and that's a reminder, again, that the election department employees were fallible humans. And even this great trove of data we're talking about today has gaps and has mistakes. You'll note that 3 of the women on this list were first-generation immigrants. If I'd been able to fit the other columns on the slide, you can look on the spreadsheet to see that Ellen Finneran, Isabel Monroe, and Roberta Gay had to bring their husbands' naturalization papers, as Marta explained, according to federal law. And the 3 other married women, although they were all born in the United States, also had to provide information about their husbands' birthplaces. The records list housewife as the occupation of 5 out of the 6 married women. So 5 out of the 9 total and 5 of the 6 married women. That's a higher proportion than housewife voters across Boston overall. Housewife and variant terms were the most common occupation listed on the voter registers, but still, by my rough count, only about 12% of the women who registered in Boston were recorded as housewives, and about 10% of the women who registered to vote in Jamaica Plain were housewives. At least 4 of these first 9 women worked for wages. Mrs. Isabel Monroe and Miss Lucy McGraw did housework for pay. You have to be careful in looking, like housewife and housework denote different things on these voting registers. Housework meant like a domestic servant or a paid housekeeper for the most part, while housewife was not paid. Lucy's unmarried sister Margaret was a sales lady, and Edith Grossman worked at the Holzer Cabot Electric Company, although it didn't specify what her title was. And we see that like rise at the time of white collar occupations for women all across these voter registers, stenographers and clerks, and you'll hear some more about different occupations later. 4 days after those first 9 women, Judith Windsor Smith registered to vote at the age of 98. She was the oldest woman in Boston among the 56,000 plus to claim her right to vote. And Smith had not only been waiting, but working for the right to vote throughout her entire life. She had held leadership positions in numerous state, local, and national suffrage associations for the previous 4 decades. She wrote often for the Women's Journal, which was the leading national suffragist newspaper headquartered here in Boston. She gave frequent public speeches for the cause, and she, in fact, spent so much time working for suffrage that her family said when they couldn't find her at home and they were looking for her, they just checked the suffrage headquarters, where she would invariably be like addressing envelopes or doing whatever behind the scenes work needed to be done at the time. Another fun story about Judith Windsor Smith is in 1894, she apparently brought copies of the Woman's Journal with her to the lighthouse in Scituate. She was the oldest visitor the lighthouse had ever had. She left the newspapers there for the lighthouse keepers to read. She said since they had so much free time, she thought they might as well inform themselves about women's rights and maybe be converted to the cause in the process. Another fun story in 1911, she went on election day to the lines where voters were waiting to vote and stood there handing out suffrage leaflets to everybody who streamed by. So even though she couldn't herself cast a vote in that election, she showed up. At 93, Judith Windsor Smith marched in Boston's big suffrage parade. This was in 1915. There's a poster of it on the slide. Other famous marchers in attendance included Helen Keller. It was a parade that hoped to rally support behind a state referendum that if it had passed, I'm sorry, well, we know already that it didn't, or we wouldn't be talking about 1920 so much today. It would have granted Massachusetts women the right to vote before the 19th Amendment, as some states did. About 15,000 marchers and 30 bands assembled at the corner of Massachusetts Avenue and Beacon Street. They processed past the Public Garden, the Boston Common, the State House, ended up at Mechanics Hall, where they had a pro-suffrage rally planned. Anti-suffragists made themselves particularly visible that day. So Smith and her fellow marchers had to process past houses that were draped with red banners with anti-suffrage slogans, motor cars festooned with giant red paper flowers. The red rose was the symbol of the anti-suffragists at the time. Boys ran among the crowd of spectators selling red roses pinned to cards that had anti-suffrage messages. But fortunately, there wasn't violence at this Boston parade, as there had been at other suffrage marches, most infamously in Washington, D.C. in 1913, where there was an investigation because of all the violence against the marchers. Interviewed by the Boston Globe 5 years later, when she finally did get equal suffrage, Judith Windsor Smith called on women to exercise their new rights. She said, "For 70 years, I have been in the fight for women's suffrage, and I want every woman to go to the polls, the first election they are allowed to, and vote. Whether it rains or not," she added, "because rain is the greatest foe to honest politics there is. If it rains, the respectable voters stay at home and the political gamesters get their innings. Therefore, I say to women, go and vote even if it pours." For herself, she vowed to vote in elections for every political office as long as I live. And she added her pleasure that all the girls will be brought up to vote now. And I wish, she said, I could be here to see the wonders of the world in the years to come. Sadly, Smith was not able to enjoy her newly bestowed right to suffrage for long. She died in 1921, but what a fantastic thing that she was able to go to the polls and to vote in that election. Judith's daughter, Zilpha Drew Smith, an independent woman and well-known social reformer in her own right, had already registered weeks before her mother on August 4th. Zilpha's parents' strong support of education, abolition, and women's rights undoubtedly inspired Zilpha's own lifelong interest in social reform causes. One of 5 siblings born to Judith and Sylvana Smith, who was a shipbuilder, Zilpha had grown up in East Boston and graduated from the girls' high school, which was not common at the time for girls to graduate from high school. In 1868, Zilpha took a job as a telegraph operator for a commercial telegraph office in Boston, and then as a government clerk supervising revisions of the Suffolk County Probate Court's index. So those are a sign of those like office jobs and white collar jobs that were opening up to women of her generation. Though a self-supporting woman and with a full-time job, she always made time to volunteer, including as a relief worker during the Boston Fire of 1872. In 1879, she took a position with the Associate Charities of Boston. She first worked at the Registration Bureau, conducting confidential exchanges between families and social workers. She later became General Secretary, developing a new method of recruiting and training volunteer social workers who were known as friendly visitors to families in need. And she also advocated for mother's aid legislation in Massachusetts, helping to establish Boston's first public playground in 1900. Her last job was as associate director for the Boston School for Social Workers, later Simmons School for Social Work, where she taught classes and worked closely with students to coordinate their field placements until her retirement due to ill health in 1918. She then spent her remaining years pursuing her interests in music, literature, botany, and using her right to vote. 2 other notable Jamaica Plain women I want to mention, Emily Green Balk and Susan Walker Fitzgerald, are not, however, in the voter registers. And why not? Well, I'm not going to delve as deeply into their biographies, but Susan Walker Fitzgerald does anyone here know Susan Walker Fitzgerald? Some people. Yeah, okay. She had been, like Judith Windsor Smith, an active suffrage leader. She'd served as executive secretary of the Boston Equal Suffrage Association, the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association. She was recording secretary for the National Women's Suffrage Association. She had even run for a school board seat in Boston in 1911, although she did not win. And in 1920, the same year, she served as a national committee member for the Massachusetts Democratic Party, which had a women's division. After suffrage, she became the first woman elected as a Democrat to the Mass state legislature. So why is she not registering to vote? Even better known, Emily Green Balk, economist, sociologist, pacifist, Nobel Prize winner, born in JP in 1867. She had graduated from Bryn Mawr, returned to Boston as a settlement house worker at Denison House, and then a professor at Wellesley College. She was a leader in the Women's Trade Union League, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She contributed to forming the League of Nations, participated in numerous international commissions, contributed her whole life to social and political movements for labor rights, immigrant rights, racial justice, and women's suffrage. Her name is not in the voter registers. So you might find that surprising, but it's actually their political knowledge and involvement that suggest why they weren't there. Because women in Massachusetts did have the right to vote before 1920. In 1879, excuse me, they were extended the right to vote in school board elections, only in school board elections. And we're happy to take questions about that later. But that idea that, oh, as mothers, they should have maybe a voice in schools. Also, so many women were teachers by that point. I think that they pressured to have a voice in school board elections, but just that, no other kinds of voting. In fact, that's why Boston had separate women's voter registration books in the first place. It was just more convenient for election officials not to have to bother with like all these women's names when they were trying to run other elections besides the school board. So some women, almost certainly including Susan Walker Fitzgerald and Emily Green Balk, had registered to vote for what they called school suffrage before 1920. Just in case, some of those women did go and register again in 1920. So we do see some repeat names, but these two who would have known that wasn't necessary did not do so. And by the way, they are not the only prominent Boston suffragists who are not in our database. And yes, it took us a few minutes of thought to figure out why all of these prominent suffragists were not in the data that we were looking at. Okay. Last case I want to walk you through, and then I will turn over to Laura Kitchings. Despite her name not being on the registers, I learned that Susan Walker Fitzgerald lived at 7 Greenough Avenue, and that inspired me to take a closer look at that lovely street as an example of how we, and by we, I mean you as well, can tease out different kinds of stories from the data in the voter registers, because we're hoping to inspire you all to work with this public database. The questions they evoke about what these women thought and experienced at the time. So we can sketch a collective portrait like the one I talked about when I first came up here, the 9 first voters in the Minton building. We can do that with the women on Greenough Avenue. They were all native born to the US, we would learn. There were 19 of them. 16 of the 19 were born in Massachusetts. Housewife was the most prevalent occupation. No surprise there. Average age, 44, et cetera, et cetera. And again, some of those discoveries do challenge our assumptions of which women wanted to vote. Anti-suffragists claim that married women didn't want or need to vote because they just duplicate their husbands' votes. So knowing that this was such a common occupation listed shows that women did not agree with that, and given the chance to vote, they were going to seize it. Of course, that collective portrait would be different for other streets. In fact, it would be really interesting to compare them to other parts of JP, and we'll hear about other parts of JP shortly, as well as to other parts of Boston. So we could do that. Another story we could tell, though, is based on place. And so I liked how compact this street happens to be. Greenough Avenue stretches from Center Avenue downtown to Elm Street. It's 0.2 of a mile long. And when I mapped it out, at least one woman from most of the houses on the street registered to vote in 1920, including others who lived at number 7 at the same time as Susan Walker Fitzgerald, who had probably already registered to vote, right? In fact, many of the houses on Greenough Avenue, 5 of them in particular, had multiple new voters, and I have images of those here. So we have a total of at least 19, but probably more than 19 voters on this short street, if we count others who had registered for school board elections. The first to register was at number 2, Helen Jacobs. Remember that name. She was a college student at Wellesley College. And at the same day, Sarah E. Leonard from number 26, who was a 62-year-old housekeeper. Did they know each other? Probably by sight, but I don't know. This is one of the things that it takes a lot of work to try to unpack, and maybe some questions we can never answer. So maybe it's a coincidence they picked the same day. For the most part, the Greenough Avenue neighbors don't seem to have gone together to register to vote. There are just 2 other times with multiple Greenough Avenue voters on the rolls. There's August 20th, when Hannah Hand and Ellen Dolan from number 7 and number 21, both older housewives, registered. When I imagine that, I think maybe they did go together to vote, that perhaps they were friends. And then on October 7th, 5 Greenough Avenue residents registered. All of them happened to be self-supporting women. There was a student back at number 7, a bookkeeper at number 14 named Maud Sullivan, and then the 3 Shea sisters, who not only lived together, here's their signatures in the rolls, they all lived together at number 21, and they were all teachers, although they taught at 3 different schools. Gertrude and Louise clearly went together. Their lines in the register clearly directly follow one another. Something we learned to do that you can do with the data set is see like what names follow each other, because it shows you who was online in that order, right? So you can sort it by the date, and in the original order, it shows who was standing in line next to each other. Their oldest sister, Mary, was signed in a different volume entirely in the general register, suggesting she wasn't in or near JP that day, but it can't be a coincidence that she went to register to Boston City Hall on the same day as her sisters. So that sounds like a pact and kind of suggests conversations that were going on. In fact, there were a lot of self-supporting women. The image over here on the right-hand side shows many working women clustered together on that same day, Thursday, October 7th. A popular day for working women to register, I guess. I think a lot of it has more to do with the time. They were later on the list for that day, so probably not in the morning, and probably at a later time of day when they were able to present themselves after working hours. So these are some of the kind of context clues that also help us alongside with the research that we can do. The last resident from Greenough Avenue to register in the database back at number 2 was 52-year-old housewife Jenny Jacobs, Helen Jacobs' mother. So the first person to register on the street was daughter Helen, and the last woman just getting her registration in on time to vote for president was her mother. What conversations about suffrage might the mother of daughter have had in the months since August 17th when Helen registered? Was this a story of persuasion or procrastination? The registers can't tell us, but maybe with persistent research, other records will emerge in the future that will tell us. Laura Kitchings is up now to show us some maps. Fun maps.
So hi, I'm jumping in for just a moment, and then I'll send it back to Marta for some other stories in a moment. But I'm going to discuss the birthplaces of the new voters because I think it helps drive home their diversity. And for those of you in the room, you can't really see the numbers, and those of you on Zoom can, but I'm hoping to give you just vibes. Under 70% of the new voters were born in New England. About 16% were born in the rest of the US and Canada, and over 15% were born outside of North America. In some cases, women born outside of the United States and Canada were born to US citizens residing elsewhere. But as we have discussed throughout the presentation, many immigrants earned their right to vote and claimed their right to vote. For now, notice how many voters were recorded as in what is now Russia, if you can see that in the room. Many of these women were in fact born in what is now Lithuania, Ukraine, and other independent countries. I'll discuss in a moment later in the presentation how I dealt with this, but just understand that that number is not necessarily reflecting reality. In general, I'm asking to start thinking about the registries not just as a reflection of Boston area stories, but start thinking about the worldwide historical contexts that led to these women registering to vote. Looking at the state map and Providence map, we see a similar story. This was a period of significant migration to Boston, partially due to the Industrial Revolution, You can also see the influence of the Great Migration to Boston as African Americans moved north from the southern states. I am going to ask you to look at the caption for one moment. I'm going to refer to Ward 22. That is vaguely Jamaica Plain at the time. There's a little bit of bleeding and a little bit of overlap, but because I'm using a computational tool, I had to pick a specific ward to deal with. So Jamaica Plain, again, we see around just under 70% of born in New England. And we see a similar number of immigrant voters. The birthplace percentages, again, roughly the same overall. So we see the diversity of Jamaica Plain and the immigrants to this community. And very briefly, I want to end my section here on this map, which shows that this is mainly an East Coast story in Ward 22. What is going on in Eastern Canada that's causing women to come down is something that has been documented, but is worth thinking of in terms of the story of women registering to vote. But for now, I think I'm going to ask you to go back here, look briefly at the Scandinavian countries, especially Sweden, and I'm going to hand it over to Marta, who will go into more detail there.
Thank you. So last year, when I was preparing for a similar talk at the West Roxbury Historical Society, and I was looking at Ward 23 voters, that's mostly West Roxbury and Rosendale, I started noticing a really high number of Scandinavian birthplaces in the registers, especially Sweden. And that surprised me because I had never really heard that West Roxbury or Rosendale had a Scandinavian community. So to get a visual on how many Ward 23 voters were from Scandinavia and where they lived in the ward, I created this map using Google My Maps, and I plotted the home addresses of new voters born in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And as you can see, there's a significant number of new voters from those countries. And so when I started preparing for this presentation, I wondered if that extended out of the West Roxbury and Rosendale area and into Jamaica Plain. And so I added to my map. And as you can see, I found a smaller but still significant number of Scandinavian-born voters, again, especially from Sweden. Now, we do know that at the end of the 19th century, Scandinavian immigration to the United States increased, especially immigration from Sweden. Earlier waves of Swedish immigrants had often been farming families, but a wave of immigration starting in about 1890 was primarily young single men and women. The young men were often fleeing military service, and both men and women were looking for economic opportunity. Upon landing on the East Coast, many of these new immigrants got straight onto trains and went to the Midwest, but some did stay on the Eastern Seaboard. And single women were often settling in cities where they worked as domestic labor. And we can see evidence of this Scandinavian immigration in Boston. This is the Massachusetts Compendium of the 1920 census. And I know it's hard to see if you're in the room, but I've highlighted the numbers for Scandinavian countries. It's definitely not the largest group of arrivals in Boston by any stretch, but we can see that the city is home to a little under 1,000 Danish-born individuals, about 1,800 people born in Norway, and over 6,700 Swedish-born residents. So going back to Jamaica Plain, we can see Scandinavian-born voters are spread throughout the ward. Now, in West Roxbury and Rosendale, these folks tended to live in clusters. It's not so much the case in JP, but there were certainly Scandinavian voters living as neighbors. And so I decided to zoom in on a few of these folks and just dig a little deeper into the women I found. And I noticed that on Carolina Avenue, we had two Swedish-born women living across the street from each other. Josephina Engberg Rosen and Selma Swetson. Josephine registered on October 6th, and Selma registered just in the nick of time on October 13th. And here's a map of where they lived in a contemporary atlas. Now, though Josephine and Selma's stories diverge in insignificant ways, something they have in common is that they both moved to JP at around the same time. Josephine arrives in 1900, and Selma arrives in 1903. And both of them move around JP quite a bit before they end up living across the street from each other. Selma is born in Sweden in 1876 and emigrates to the United States with her husband Alexander in October of 1902. They arrive in Boston on the Cunard Line ship, the Ivernia, and you can see on this passenger list that Selma is listed as a woman weaver and Alexander is listed as a laborer. Now, I know this is really difficult to read, but they're also listed as having a contact, probably a friend in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's possible they went there for a short period with that friend, but we find them in JP pretty soon after they arrive, and tax records show them living on Carolina Avenue in 1903. There is a lot that we don't know about Selma. She's proved difficult to track down. Did she continue to weave when she settled in Jamaica Plain was one of my questions. Her census records and her voter registration list list her as at home or married. But I wondered if she continued to practice weaving either to make textiles for herself and her family, or if she sold pieces that she wove. One tidbit we do know about her is that sometime in 1909, Selma, either with her husband or without, was in Russell, Minnesota, because her daughter Mabel was born there. This is Russell, Minnesota, in about 1909, and her daughter's census records. Mabel would have been 11 in 1920 when her mother registered to vote, and I wondered if did Mabel, was she in this building with Selma when she registered? Did she come with her? Did she stand in line with her? Now, whether or not Mabel stood in line with her mother, we do have some evidence that she had an independent streak. In 1932, when Mabel was 23 years old, we find her on this passenger list, returning to Boston from abroad, likely from Canada. The Prince David was a ship that went back and forth between Boston and Canada. We also see that she has a home address on Washington Street in Rosendale. Her parents were not living in Rosendale, and she's not married, so it appears that she struck out on her own. She eventually marries a man named Herbert, whose parents had also immigrated from Sweden, who also shows up on Boston, Canada passenger lists, and they settled in West Roxbury, so not too far from home. Selma, meanwhile, lives in Jamaica Plain, well into her 70s. Now, Selma's across the street neighbor, Josephine, or Josephina, as her name is written in some records, arrived in JP within a few years of Selma, but has a different story that is sadly tinged with a lot of tragedy. Unlike Selma, Josephina immigrates to Boston as a single woman. And we're not sure when she arrived, but we know she was in the city by May 7th, 1892, because on that day she marries Eric Rosen, a Swedish-born tailor, 4 years younger than herself. And this is their marriage record. On her marriage record, Josephina is listed as a domestic, which, as I mentioned, was typical of many single Scandinavian women who immigrated to the United States. She might have been in the US for as many as 4 years prior to her marriage doing domestic labor. This 1888 record of a spinster, Josephina Ingberg, might be her arrival record, though there are a few discrepancies, including the spelling of her name, that makes it uncertain. In any case, in 1892, she marries Eric, who is working as a tailor downtown, and they move to 34 Forbes Street in present-day Hyde Square. And it is at 34 Forbes Street that Josephina has her first son, Charles, in 1895, who tragically dies in their home just a few months after his birth. 2 years later, Josephina has a second son, Clarence Eric. Clarence grows up on Carolina Street and is still living there with his family at age 23 in 1920, when Josephina claims her right to vote. Tragically, only a little more than a year after claiming her right to vote, Josephina dies of cervical cancer on December 21st, 1921. Shortly after Josephina's death, Clarence, like Mabel across the street, moves to the West Roxbury-Rosendale area. And like Mabel, he also marries another child of Swedish immigrants. This is his marriage license. Josephina and Selma's stories are evidence that there is not one immigrant story, right? Even when immigrants come from the same country of birth and settle in the same neighborhood across the street from each other. But though Josephina and Selma's lives diverged in some significant ways, they had one especially significant commonality. In the fall of 1920, they both seized their right to vote. Now, as I was going through this map of Scandinavian-born voters, I noticed 2 other Swedish-born women living as neighbors on Orchard Street. And I started to investigate them, but after just a few record searches, I began to become increasingly intrigued by this one house on 58 Orchard Street. So my attention was first drawn to the address because of 43-year-old Augusta Osterland. And this is her voting record up on the screen. Augusta was born in Sweden in 1877, and on September 22nd, 1920, when she registered to vote in this building, she gave her occupation as homekeeper. Her employers, a mother and a daughter, had registered to vote a few days earlier. 38-year-old Lucille Gulliver registered to vote on September 16th, and her mother Emma, who was 65, registered on September 18th. Now, though these three women appear really different on the surface, different ages, occupations, socioeconomic status, land of birth, they share some intriguing commonalities. Emma, the oldest of the trio, was originally from New Hampshire. She was the daughter of a school teacher and began teaching school herself at the age of 19, first in Hyde Park and then in Brookline. She taught until she was 26 years old when she married. And at the time, Boston Public Schools did not allow married women to keep their jobs as teachers, so she would have had to quit. 11 years into that marriage, Emma's husband Charles died, and she was left with their young daughter, Lucille. Now, at the time, it would not have been uncommon for a widow with a young child to turn to family, but Emma went back to work, eventually becoming the master of the Dillaway School and an active member of the National Education Association, the Women's City Club, and the 20th Century Club. She also traveled internationally. She shows up on several passenger lists, returning from trips to both Canada and England. Lucille, her daughter, appears to have inherited both her mother's interest in education and her independence. She attends Boston University and becomes an author and a literary editor, focusing especially on books for younger people. She taught writing classes at local universities, and newspaper articles talk about how she is very inspirational to other writers. She also appears to have had several extracurricular activities and interests, one of which was involvement in the international peace movement. Like her mother, she also traveled internationally, and she shows up on many, many, many passenger lists at US ports of entry. We can surmise that Emma influenced Lucille's independence and her interest in international education, travel, and young people. I think we can also make a pretty good guess that Emma influenced Lucille's interest in voting, or maybe vice versa. Maybe Lucille influenced her mother. What we do know is that as early as 1904, Emma and Lucille are registering to vote together in those school board elections that Laura mentioned. Only a small minority of women registered in those elections, but Emma and Lucille are among them. And because they moved house so often, they registered frequently because they re-registered every time they moved because they wanted to make sure that they could vote. Now, on the surface, Emma and Lucille don't appear to have much in common with Augusta, their housekeeper. When Augusta comes to the United States in 1895, her occupation is servant, and it's likely she traveled in first class. Lucille, meanwhile, is usually on lists of first-class passengers when we find her on passenger lists. But we can see some interesting connections and commonalities here. In the 1910 census, we find Lucille and Emma living together with a servant to help them keep house. Lydia Smart, their housekeeper, the census record is up here, was born in the United States, but her parents are from Norway and Sweden. That same year, Lucille is writing a book called Friendship of the Nations, published in 1912, and she also traveled to Stockholm, Sweden for the International Peace Convention. So she had spent time in Sweden. So when Lucille and Emma hired Augusta to help them keep house, it may have been a coincidence that Augusta was originally from Sweden, or perhaps there was an existing connection to or interest in the Swedish community. Augusta and her employers also shared, I think, a sense of independence. At the age of 21, Augusta left Sweden, boarded the ship, her ship here, and sailed to the United States. On the passenger list, she says she has a sister living in New York who has paid her passage and that she plans to go to New York. Yet we find her in Boston. And though it is really, really hard to track Augusta down, she does appear to have been in Boston and Brookline for years by the time we find her living with the Gullivers. And when Augusta walked into this building and stepped up to the registration table, she presented her own naturalization papers. After declaring her intent to naturalize in 1916, as you can see here, she took an oath of citizenship in 1919, and a little less than a year later, she claimed her right to vote. Now, I like to imagine the conversations that Augusta might have had with Lucille and Emma about registering. I like to think about what it might have been like on November 2nd when they all went to vote on the same day. But I doubt that Augusta needed the influence or prodding of her employers. 2 years after claiming her right to vote, Emma dies at her house at 58 Orchard Street. Lucille appears to have lived by herself for the rest of her life, eschewing having a housekeeper and continuing to write, teach, and advocate for peace. And Augusta disappears. I could not find her in the 1930 census or in other records, but she is famously hard to track down. So I think it's likely that she continued to live and work and vote in the Boston area. So I think this register is interesting because it catches Augusta, Emma, and Lucille at one moment in their lives, right? When their storylines intersect at 58 Orchard Street and in this building. But when we dig deeper into the records, we find three complex stories that led them to this neighborhood and this voter registration site. So I've zoomed in on the stories of some women I found by looking more closely at this map of Scandinavian-born voters. And Laura is going to wrap us up by talking about some other groups of immigrant voters and how you can use the data set yourself.
So my goal as we start wrapping up is to start talking about my own experiences working with the data set, especially using computational tools, but also, and this is the most important, encourage you all to go out and use the data set yourselves. And we'd love to talk to you later about how you can do that and any help we can give you with that. But a while ago, I was discussing, there was a significant number of women in Ward 22 born in Eastern Canada. And many of you who know far more about Jamaica Plain and history than I do can talk more about this. But I did use a computational tool to place the birth towns of these new voters from Ward 22. The tool I used was unable to identify the birth towns of some new voters from Eastern Canada for several reasons. Many of the former towns no longer exist and can't be found on a modern map. So I'd use historical data to find their former latitude and longitude. Many of the towns have merged and now go by different names, or the women gave the names of the women during the registration project, which was never an official town. And also some women just gave a geological, there we go, feature to the clerk, such as a bay or a local river or a mountain when registering to vote. Some of these I've been able to guess, as you can see, I'll talk about in a moment. A lot of them I've not been able to find yet. But there is a fair amount of disparities between official records and the records the information the women gave to clerks in Canada. The other big issue is a number of the towns seem to be, given in the register, seems to be guesses at the names of towns by the town clerks because they could not understand the accents of the women registering to vote. So especially when the towns are based on French Canadian names or Indigenous names, the Boston clerks, again, look at how many women they were registering per day. They wrote down what they could get out. And in some cases, we've also run into this issue with some Swedish-born voters. And so we've started doing some interesting guesswork and some crowdsourcing, which Marta did early on, to try and figure out some of these names. But I did want to talk about two women from Eastern Canada, the Newcomb sisters, Frances R. and Lucy Newcomb, there we go, both attempted to register to vote on October 2nd. The Massachusetts-born Frances was successful. However, the Nova Scotia-born Lucy was not, as she did not have the proper papers that day. She did come back. And the reason I assume, if you look, that her in the first registry, her first attempt to register, this is easier to see on Zoom, she did not give a town name, but when she came back and was successful to register to vote, she did. What I assume happened is that the clerk simply stopped filling out the information when she realized that this would not be a successful registration. I do want to draw you to the age of these women. Again, as Laura and Marta both discussed, there is this assumption that these were all young women who registered to vote. And this is proof at 63 and 71 that women of all ages tried to register to vote. You can barely see at the bottom here, but I got very excited when I found their 1930 census entry that they had then moved to Long Beach, California, and were hopefully living out their best lives. But again, as we start looking for these women, you've seen this in both presentations, we spend a lot of time looking at newspaper articles. Here we see Frances in 1884 becoming the third assistant at a school, so clearly had a very long career in the Boston school system. And one of the other favorite things I love to look at is travel records. And here on the side, we have Lucy going on a boat trip, going between Plymouth and New York. And this makes me excited because we don't just see travel records of when there's a tragedy or something goes wrong on the trips. We simply see a report of people celebrating these embarkations. Now we go to Prince Edward Island new voters. And again, it seems like I've gotten a fair number of them. The biggest circle is where there's 5 women new voters. Smaller circles are 1 each, and there's one that's 2. However, this is only half of the women from Prince Edward Island in Ward 22. Still working on the rest, or many of them simply did not have their birth town recorded. I should mention for my work, I don't differentiate between women who are successful and unsuccessful in registering to vote. I think we need to recognize everyone who made the attempt. I do want you to draw you to this nice purple arrow of Bedek, excuse my pronunciation, to talk about in a moment. And you'll notice there's only one new voter registered as born there. However, as we'll see in a moment, there were actually two born there, Isabella T. Webley and Mary L. Jane. And again, this is a proof that this moment is only one moment of their lives in 1920s. They lived many other complex lives. Notice at 1920, both these women were living at 4 Peter Parley Road. I did have a birth town for Myra, which I put on the map before, which helped my research. And then these women seemed to disappear, or I could not find Isabella T. at all. I eventually found some newspaper articles on the bottom there. It's hard to see, but you'll see Myra L. Wilson, maiden name Robbins. Some other research showed this was Myra L. Dane after her at least second marriage. There may have been other marriages there. And then I was looking for Isabella T. Webley. I finally found Isabella T. Green and was able to do enough research to figure out that this was the same woman after, again, an additional marriage. She was now the department president of the Women's Relief Corps of the Grand Army of the Republic of Boston, which seemed to rise in social status from simply being at home, which again is likely another term for housewife, although at this point she would have been a widow, living with, I'm going to give you the punchline here for the next slide, with her sister. So trying to find, I know none of you can see this, but again, one of the frustrations we have working with this data set is we can't always find information about the women. We have to find information about their husbands. In this case, we have the naturalization record of Isabella T. Webley's first husband, John Wellesley Webley, who mentions he got naturalized in 1902 and that he was residing in Boston with his wife. So that shows that she was in Boston at least from 1902, assuming she was the wife. But then in 1935, from the earlier slide, we had a new last name of Green. We have her marriage record, that she got married at 62 to her 89-year-old boss, who was I'm going to read from the slide, the state commander of I'm not going to read it. I give up on that. I lied. She was state commander of a Civil War organization. So he fought in the Civil War, came back, had quite the life in Jamaica Plain, and then married his housekeeper. So again, finding these people, we're not always going with the same name that they were in the registries. They have maiden names, they have second names, they have multiple names. And many of you know this from genealogical research, right? But the other exciting thing about this article that, again, was exciting mainly only to me, was it did give her maiden name, which is the same maiden name as Myra L. It also gave her birthplace as being Bedek. So that put the two women for me connect together. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of information about the Lucretia Crocker School, as you can find plenty on the Jamaica Plain website. And for a lot of this, I was directly taking information from the Jamaica Plain Historical Society website, which is excellent, and I will send you all there this information instead of simply narrating what I already found. But I want you to notice that at the bottom of this, we have 3 teachers teaching there. And if you look at the key, the 2 teachers were identified using slightly different terms, which is fairly typical for the registries. There were no such things as standardized terms for the clerks in terms of occupations. I'll talk about this a little more in a moment, which can be frustrating when you start working with the data set yourself. But as long as you're aware of it, you can know that it's there. But looking at these women, I was thinking about only looking at women who worked in Jamaica Plain, but with Florence Horowitz, she both lived and worked in Jamaica Plain. And not surprisingly, you'll notice sisters seem to be a theme of my section. She lived with her sister and the rest of their family. And you'll notice there's 2 addresses here if you look carefully. You'll see 5 Woodside Avenue, I apologize. But then later on, you see that their residence was 841 Blue Hill Avenue. So simply put, they moved during the year of 1920. Again, this is fairly typical. People were moving around during this time. So you can't assume this is, again, one moment in their lives. Where they lived on April 1st and where they lived when they registered may not have been the same place. I will ask that you look down at Florence's record, though, and I should mention Horowitz is a surprisingly common name in the registries, so you can't always depend on the last name meaning that people are related, as many of you, again, know from genealogical research. But if you look at Florence's birthplace, you'll see I'm not going to try to say that, but you'll see they were both born in Russia. I'm going to say Smorgon as the town of birth for Florence. And this is where I have to send a huge thank you to this transcription team, which I was not part of, because they went and researched the birthplaces. In this case, they place her birthplace in what is current day Belarus. This is incredibly helpful when using mapping tools, because otherwise you get a number of women in Russia who would not have identified themselves as Russian. So again, you can, on this map, for Ward 22, you can still see I have 10 women born in Russia. If you can see that in the room, it's fairly small. But many of these women, again, were born in Lithuania, Ukraine, etc. But again, when they were writing down their registration information, there was likely an issue of the registrar not understanding where they were born and just putting down Russia. And jump ahead here. So those of you who follow our Instagram account will recognize this story. I'll encourage you again to do that in a moment. This is the New England Confectionery Company as it existed in South Boston from 1902 to 1927. New voter Josephine A. Ryan, later Randall, worked here as a chocolate dipper in 1920. Before working on the Instagram post, I assumed that chocolate dipping was an unskilled female occupation. I was wrong. It was considered a gendered occupation. However, it was skilled labor that required significant experience, and it was difficult to get hired without this experience. Research for a 1913 congressional report notes that an average chocolate dipper handled 75 to 80 pounds of chocolate per day. She registered to vote, who worked as an inspector at the Farrington Manufacturing Company, which produced jewelry and eyeglass cases. I was again surprised to find that inspectors were primarily female, as explained in this advertisement for employment in 1920. Of course, they were looking for quote unquote girls. This was likely similar to the ad that Helen K. Ryan replied to for employment. Again, both these were new voters. So far, I've found little about employment life at the factory, but on the screen here, we have a fact. They went to a 1920 Christmas party with gifts, an appearance by the owner as Santa Claus. Again, I'm not going to go into details about the Thomas G. Plant Shoe Company because there's plenty of information available through JP Historical Society, which I very much appreciated and loved reading. But I do want to note that they paid above going rate and provided many amenities for their workers. So it was a good job to have. And this next one might start hurting your brain. However, on the bottom here, and I know you can't see it, it's a little out of focus, and that's probably a good thing, are all the different ways the plant might try and am I making it worse? Yep. I think that's as good as it's going to get for now. But if you look at all these different names across the bottom, I'm not asking you to read them. That's all the way the Thomas G. Plant was recorded in the registries. So as you're going through, you can't just go and go, I'm going to look for Thomas G. Plant. You have to look for the variants that you start finding. I will notice the colors represent the different wards of the workers. So you'll notice a lot of the women on your left, or wards that I'll show in a moment, were from South Boston. And all the way on the right in the brown are the women from Ward 22. Again, women on the far right or far left were from South Boston. And this is where wards maps that both our colleague Erin and Marta have worked on putting together that help us show the overview of the wards at the time. And again, we can find that the women working in Ward 13 from Ward 13, 14, and 15 were living in South Boston and commuted to JP. Again, this will hurt your brain, so don't look too carefully at it. These are the different occupations recorded of the women working at the Thomas G. Plant factory. And again, many of them are duplicates. For example, we have workers and shoe workers. We also seem to have packers and shoe packers. So we can assume, again, these were the same occupation. You'll notice at the bottom, there are a number of clerks. These likely included stenographers and other specified occupations. But again, my theory is that the registrars just put down clerk for an office job. At the very top, you'll see a dictaphone operator. And this is the story I'd like to end on, because we have Eileen V. Gululi, I apologize for my pronunciation, who is the only dictaphone operator listed, the Thomas G. Plant. And our colleague Erin came up with this wonderful picture of a dictaphone. I'm going to send you back to her Instagram to find her post on it, which goes into the details of how the dictaphone was used. But I should notice that in the Boston records of the time, there are surprisingly 2 Eileen v. Guliel's, which surprised me. One is a miss, one is a Mrs. I believe the one which is second from the right is the one in the registries who registered to vote, mainly because she's recorded as a miss and she is unmarried in the registries. Again, this is not 100% accurate, but she is here working, thank you. And here she is working at a community Irish fair. And again, showing life in their community at that time, not just at work or their marital status, which is what we tend to see in the registries. So our colleague Anna put together this slide about using the data set. And she's encouraging everyone to do text searching. If there's a last name you're interested in, bring it up, simply see if you can find that name or that address. You can also, using spreadsheet tools, do filtering for a specific address, which often makes the data set look significantly smaller, or simply look for a word that you're interested in. Again, to limit the information in this wall of data that can seem, with 54,000+ entries, it can be a little overwhelming at first. I speak from experience here. The other thing I would encourage you is, if you find someone you're interested in the data set, go back and see who is on either side of them on the data set. As Laura mentioned earlier, this helps you see who they were next to in line and may show a connection. Again, Anna put together this wonderful slide about voter research tools. We'll have this in the information in the QR code I'll provide in a moment. But again, the most important things, I think, are the Boston Street Book, because a number of addresses no longer really exist in Boston. And that's a way you can find things that have seemed to disappeared. And again, I mentioned before the importance of the ward and precinct maps to find locations of where the women would have lived. And this is where I encourage you all to stay in touch. As I mentioned before, we are on social media. We have a very active Instagram account. We're also on Blue Sky. And we love hearing stories that other people have found. Again, we're a relatively small team of, I think, 6 or 7 now. And again, we're all following our own interests, which are not necessarily the interests you all have in the data set. So we love hearing the interests other people have found. Again, we're all coming at this from a different point of view. So here I'm going to throw up our QR code. If you can, take a picture of that on your phone. I feel okay teasing. Eventually we'll have a website that you can all visit and find out some of our longer stories. Again, Instagram only allows us to give very short snippets. But I think we can open it up for questions. That works for everyone.
If I don't have a website, where does this reside?
Right now, it mainly resides on a mixture of a Google Doc and a link tree.
Oh, do you mean the data set?
Or the data set?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The data set is with the city of Boston. So it's at data.boston.gov. But if you use the QR code, that goes to that will give you a direct link to the data set. Yeah. We should say that the data set was created. Oh, sorry. I'll get closer and repeat the question. So the question was, where does the data set live? The data set lives at data.boston.gov because the original project was done in collaboration with the city of Boston, with the city archives, with the data analytics team. Yeah.
At various points, you all have mentioned just coming across human error and different things that you could then like figure out should be different. And I'm curious, as archivists, like what is your approach to that in digitizing this and balancing like the actual record versus what people now might be searching for and want like updated information?
Do you want to?
I mean, you're the archivist.
That's true.
Yeah, I can give the historian point of view, which we appreciate seeing the errors and not having it sanitized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I was going to just jump in quickly as someone who is using a computational tool.
Yeah.
I think the normalization then has to happen after the fact. So I don't change things in the actual data set. I change things in my copy of the data set that's in my software, which I use Tableau Public.
Right. And one of the things that was really great about the fact that this was a collaboration between historians and archivists and historian archivists is that we had the historical expertise to research those errors. And then we used the notes field with abandon, I would say. And so we wouldn't put Belarus into the country because that's not what the clerk wrote down, but we would put in the notes field, this is likely Belarus because of et cetera, et cetera. And then that helps with the normalization.
Yeah, so the notes field, in the digitized data set is stuff that you all have added?
Yes.
Okay. When I was looking at it before this, I wasn't sure if those were notes that were added at the time or.
Got it.
It's both,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yeah.
It does include both, but you should. I mean, if it says something like this is likely Belarus, that would be a modern edition, but there were notes written in the margin and we would include those there as well if there was a note written outside of the regular field. Right.
I want to touch on that a bit because you were talking earlier about where we see the naturalization records of the women. A lot of times, I believe it's the occupation field will have their marital status. So in some cases, it'll simply in that occupation field have their marital status, or again, talking about normalization of data, it'll have single stenographer, widowed stenographer in the occupation field. So in a lot of ways, that occupation field also is a bit of a catch-all that was used at the time, not by people today.
Yes.
Not a question, but just sort of a wondering, the two women that live on Carolina Avenue, they lived directly next door to the Jamaica Plain neighborhood house, which is a settlement house. If you look on the map, it was located there at the time. It originally wasn't by the phone and then it turned into.
Yeah.
So I wonder, them being immigrants, if they got services through there or their kids, and then maybe they're in the records of the neighborhood house, which would be a collection. I wrote
That's a
whole
great
article.
idea.
Okay. There.
Yeah.
That's a basic.
Wow. That's really cool. I know I looked for settlement workers knowing that there was the settlement you mentioned in JP, and I did not find in Ward 22 anyone with the occupation listed of settlement worker. There are people listed as settlement workers in the big data set. So, but as we know, clerks made mistakes. They made a lot of assumptions, especially if a woman was married, they kind of assumed she didn't have any other job. And we have some really great examples of a top physician and a decorated artist who worked with war veterans, and they were both listed as just housewife on the record. So if we had names to, like, if someone wanted to look for particular names, knowing who the folks who worked at the settlement as well as those who went to the settlement were, that would be a great project.
Yeah, they might not be employees, but
right.
They might be just,
if
getting.
Exactly. Yeah, we would need names
Yeah.
to look for, I think.
Something else that is interesting about those two women is they have been in JP for a long time before they moved to those addresses at Carolina Ave. So they're just continually moving around what I think is like a half-mile block of air, and they just seem to be moving every 2 years. So they had been, and one of them had been moving basically up and down Carolina and Everett Street, which is really interesting, but I wonder if that settlement house is maybe part of it. So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
How are we doing on Zoom?
The Zoom audience is being shy.
I would like to add one thing that I believe you mentioned, Marta mentioned at an earlier presentation. If not, we can credit whoever did. But one of the things that we assume seems to have happened is that when a number of women were coming through, the clerks may have just pre-written housewife in a lot of the data sets and then sometimes corrected it and sometimes crossed it out and wrote an occupation. And we have to assume that just due to busyness and craziness, they just kept the housewife, because especially physicians seem to be noted as housewives.
Yeah.
And of course, there's always sexism at play, I would say.
No respect.
Yeah.
Assumptions.
Thank you. Great.
Great. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Oh,
You have a really broad vision for what this all may lead to.
We have great ambitions, but we are at this point all volunteer core. When we started the project, Marta and I both worked at institutions that gave some degree of institutional support. And now we are on our own independent researchers.
Yes.
It's a labor of love. So we are starting work on a website, but we're open to ideas, and we don't have a GoFundMe or anything, which I don't know. Yeah, it's a labor of love. So we would just like to at least keep giving presentations and have people follow our stories on Instagram, because we very profoundly believe this is not just our data, but it is the public record. It belongs to everyone. And that's why our priority is really to encourage other people to know about it and to use it creatively. It could be used in developing curricula for, people who want to bring it into the classroom. It could be for family research or house research, local history. So that's our priority right now, is speaking to community groups to make them aware of it. And then, yeah, we have big dreams, but no funding.
And also, one of the exciting things about working on this project as someone who is not involved in the transcription part of it is just seeing how the transcription team has gone on to do other work based on this. So it's sort of creating this Mary Eliza network, I feel, of people who have worked with the data. And again, feel free to join the network.
Yeah. And we have talked to one-on-one, including academic researchers who there's a pair of economists who are using the data set and doing some modeling, and there's all sorts of applications for it. And we're happy to talk to anybody and encourage them along.
You know Laura in the Massachusetts History
Yes, I do, Freddie. Nice to see you here. That sounds like a great conversation.
Yep, sounds fabulous.
We had a question over here.
Let's have a question, just, I guess if you're like trying to encourage people to work with the data set, like honestly, I clicked on it because I was interested in the voting angle, and I ended up being able to find out more about one of the first people who owned the house that I live in.
Ooh.
Awesome.
Very hard time finding information on, because her name is exactly the same as a famous author. who is
Yes.
alive.
Yeah.
I think I haven't gone into that more, but I didn't have that information
Mhm.
before I looked at this data set. So I don't know, I just like encourage people to just use it even for that, even if you're not interested in like the voting part of it.
Yeah.
Because
Yep.
it
Yeah.
provides so much
Yeah.
information on people that register to vote, that it like opens up the floodgates for all the other research.
Yeah, and how convenient there's a 1920 census to
Yes.
help corroborate a lot of that too. If anyone here or anyone you talk to and encourage to use this, turn up stories. We'd love to hear about them, so please share them back to us. We have a Gmail account that you could just write to, or you can message us through Instagram. And if you'd like to do a guest post for the Instagram, there's precedent for that too, to share your story with a broader group of people, and just, keep expanding the Mary Eliza network.
We're all about democratizing history and historical research.
Yeah.
Right, I think that's a good place for us to end. There's plenty of food out in the outside, so you can put your shoes back on and have some food and have a really great conversation. It sounds like there's some conversations to be had. So thank you very much.
Thank
for
you
being
so
here.
much.
Thank you so much for having us. We did.
Okay.